It's funny how we only seem to care about historical accuracy when the story is based on real events. But what happens when the story is fictional? Does accuracy suddenly stop mattering? That's the debate Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey has accidentally reignited. The first controversies surrounding the film focused on its armor. The costumes are not accurate versions of Bronze Age armor. Whenever a beloved classic gets adapted, the internet follows the same predictable cycle. The casting is announced, people express concerns, someone calls those concerns racist or anti-diversity, someone else claims Hollywood has abandoned authenticity, and suddenly, nobody is actually talking about the film anymore. They're arguing over what an adaptation even owes its audience. The biggest and loudest and most cloying of all controversies surrounding this film, however, involve the casting of Travis Scott and Lupita Nyong'o and a trans actor, Elliot Page, who was at first rumored to be playing the great warrior Achilles, but all this outrage for him to play a dude named Shannone, and also Tom using words like
My dad
this.
is coming home.
The conversation around the Odyssey perfectly represents this divide. One side argues that Homer's epic is mythology. It isn't history, so there is no such thing as historical accuracy. Actors are supposed to act. Directors are supposed to reinterpret stories. And audiences should stop expecting a museum exhibit every time a classic is adapted. Odyssey, like Shakespeare, is quite universal in its themes. People have reinterpreted it in their milieu several times. I think Nolan adapting the work with people of his own choice, a multiracial cast, as is usual in today's society, is totally fine.
The thing about a story like this is that there's very many versions of it, right? He really invited me to choose the version that worked best for what he had written.
But the other side raises some interesting question. Would the reaction be the same if a fictional story rooted in African or Indian tradition be portrayed by Greeks?
So rather than expanding the cultural imagination and telling new stories rooted in, say, Arab, African, or African-American histories, mythologies, and traditions, Hollywood simply recycles existing European stories and race swaps the cast.
Just because a story is fictional, does that mean it exists without history? Not really. The Odyssey may feature gods, monsters, and mythical creatures, but it is still a product of ancient Greece. Its politics, culture, geography, and worldview are inseparable from the story itself.
To the Odyssey that many people would have also liked to see Greek actors or actors resembling Greeks in a film based on one of the most foundational stories of Greek civilization and mythology. When you flatten that which is culturally specific, such that a Greek story no longer needs to be told by actors resembling Greeks, you don't just weaken the legitimacy of Greek cultural storytelling, you establish a precedent in which no culture is allowed to meaningfully belong to itself.
Fictional doesn't mean contextless. We don't question whether Westeros is real, yet nobody would expect Game of Thrones to suddenly swap Missandei and Cersei, or use words like daddy. The world only works because it feels authentic to the culture it is inspired by. There were other diverse cast members, but Lupita came under scrutiny also because Helen's character was based on her appearance, unlike Himesh, Travis, or at some degree, Zendaya, and it has been perceived a certain way for ages, but if there is criticism, it should not just limited to Lupita or Elliot, but extends to the whole cast. Representation should work for all. I think Christopher Nolan not casting anyone Greek on screen is at best a bit weird and culturally insensitive, and it should be okay to call him out on that. But call out the casting of Matt Damon, or Tom Holland, or Anne Hathaway, or Charlize Theron, who all look like they've never been close to the Aegean except on holiday. Historical authenticity isn't about proving that dragons existed. It's about making the world believable on its own terms. Forget just Helen, the entire cast is ridiculous. It's so bland and Hollywood, the trailers feel like they were made by AI to me, even though I know they weren't. Everyone is known celebrity. And this is where the debate often gets oversimplified. Online, every criticism of casting is frequently dismissed resistance to diversity. While those voices certainly exist, they're far from the whole conversation. Many people aren't arguing against representation at all. They're asking a completely different question. At what point does changing a character begin to change the story itself? A perfect example is the recent Wuthering Heights adaptation. Much of the discourse surrounding Jacob Elordi's casting as Heathcliff was immediately framed as outrage over race. But if you actually looked at many literary discussions, the criticism was far more nuanced than that. Heathcliff's ambiguous ethnicity and outsider status aren't random physical descriptions. They're fundamental to why Victorian society treats him the way it does. His identity is directly connected to the prejudice, isolation, and resentment that drive the novel. The concern wasn't simply that Jacob Elordi didn't look like Heathcliff. The concern was that removing or softening one of the defining aspects of his identity could unintentionally change the emotional foundation of the story. Whether you agree with that criticism or not, it's a discussion about narrative, not simply about race. We've seen similar conversations for decades. Fans criticized Tom Cruise as Jack Reacher not because of his ethnicity, but because Reacher's intimidating size is practically a superpower in Lee Child's novels. His physical presence changes every interaction before he even speaks. Years ago, people rejected Heath Ledger was considered the worst possible choice for the Joker, until he became the benchmark for every Joker that followed. And more so recently, Ella Bright's casting was criticized as Hannah Wells in the series Off Campus. History repeatedly proves that audiences can be spectacularly wrong about casting. But it also proves that their concerns aren't automatically rooted in prejudice. There does seem to be a side of blatant racism and hatred for these talented artists. But sometimes they're rooted in how deeply people associate certain traits with certain characters. One person expressed, "Nolan fumbled so astronomically bad. He could have stolen the opportunity to find fresh face, ethereal looks. These are gods and goddesses. They are supposed to be Greek. Why didn't he hire new Greek actors? I'm sick of seeing the same faces." Because audiences don't just remember dialogue. They remember faces, voices, physicality, presence. When a character has existed in literature for centuries, readers subconsciously build an identity around them. Over time, those traits become part of the character's language. They're not always essential, but they're rarely meaningless either. Just like when Tom Holland uses words like dad or daddy, it takes us out of the story. And that's the philosophical question at the center of every adaptation. How much can you change before you're no longer adapting the original work, but creating something entirely new? There's no objective answer. Some people believe preserving the spirit of a character matters more than preserving their appearance. Others believe appearance, culture, and identity are part of that spirit. Both arguments have merit. This article from Vogue describes it. I don't believe that representation is the be-all, end-all when it comes to promoting more diversity in Hollywood. Simply adding more racial diversity to a film is not some grand masterstroke for progress. I do think that it's more important to tell more diverse stories, representing more diverse cultures, than it is to merely cast more diverse actors. However, that does not mean casting more diverse actors is not a good overarching goal. A different version of the Odyssey could have been cast with all Greek or Greek-looking actors, and would have been totally valid as a creative choice as well. I wouldn't call that film racist any more than I would call Nolan's film woke. These are two different creative visions. There still remain many questions. Does a story belong to the writer who created it, the filmmaker reinterpreting it, or the millions of readers who have imagined those characters for decades? Maybe that's why classics are so difficult to adapt. And if we adapt every story with interpretation rather than originality, will any story belong to anywhere or represent anything? And there's still bigger problems to consider, like Christopher Nolan making a movie in such an inaccessible medium that people that can't afford or access IMAX 70mm have to resort to watching half the movie. What do you think? Tell me in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe.